Hi, this is Pat Baker, and I wanted to talk to you a little bit more about some of the additional features we talked about last week in class when we were looking at updating our bank account. And this slide presentation is going to look at adding those features to your hospital employee class. So just to review, remember we've got a special method called constructor method. It has the same name as your class. So in this case, the constructor would be called hospital employee. And here's an example of invoking the hospital employee constructor and creating an object called worker1. This line of code would be found in your test or driver class called hospital. As a review, here's our default constructor. We call it a default constructor because we're not passing any parameters into this constructor method, and this line of code that would be found in your hospital tester class would create a hospital employee named worker1. That would be the object, and that object's state would be their employee name would be Chris Smith, and number 9999, hours worked 0, and pay rate of 0. If you created another object called worker and invoked the second kind of constructor, this is an overloaded constructor. It's allowing you to pass 4 parameters, each one allowing you to set one of the instance variables. So in this case down here, Sue Smart is going to be what gets passed in as ename and then will be assigned to the emp name. 2323 will be passed in as enumber and assigned emp number. 32 for hours worked, and then 1750 for the pay rate. Just as a review, it's good practice for all of your instance variables to be private, and for your class to have an accessor method to allow any other class to get to that instance variable. This is an example where it's returning the value of an object's employee number. And there should also be a set of mutator methods that allow you to reset an instance variable. This would reset a hospital employee's employee number. We talked last week about overloaded methods. They're methods with the same name, but they have to have a different number of parameters, or they have to have different types of parameters, or the order of the parameters has to be different. So here's an example of calculate bonus. Both of these method definitions could be in our hospital employee class because, and they are overloaded because they have the same name, but they have a different number of parameters. This one requires one parameter that's a string to be passed into it, and this requires that no parameters would be passed in. That way Java can tell which method that an object is invoking by the parameter list it passes. Then we talked about static variables. Static variables are class variables. They're not associated with any given object. Here's an example of declaring a static variable to count the number of hospital employees that would be created inside the hospital class. So they'll be private. You're going to add the word static, and you'll need to initialize these variables. So they would be used to count the number of employees. So the question is, where do these objects get created? They get created inside the constructor. So if we want to count how many objects are created, we're going to go ahead and have to increment this static variable inside both constructors. Here's an example of incrementing it inside the default constructor. And you would need to do the same inside the overloaded constructor. Because we made hospital employee count private, we need an AssociatedGet method, and it's also going to be a static method, and all it does is return the hospital employee count. If we want to invoke a static method, and here's an example of invoking it inside the hospital class, you call the method, and that method's returning an integer, so we're going to put that into a variable called employees created. But what's interesting is that since this is a static method, it must be referred to with the class name. That's why I've got hospital employee here rather than worker or worker1. This is a class method. And in our case, if we created worker1 and worker, we would hope that that would return the value 2. What happens to objects when we exit a program? An object is really an area in memory, and that gets released. And Java does what's called its own garbage collection automatically. Here's an example where I created a hospital employee calling the constructor that's where we pass in 4 parameters. And then later in my code, maybe I do this. And I create another object and assign it the same variable name with the default constructor. So what happens to this information about the first object? It's completely lost. We know nothing about it, and now FS is now associated with this object. Homework tip: go ahead and take a look at this presentation. Hopefully it'll help you when you're updating your hospital employee and hospital class.